What we can say is that the organic approach of just saying employers will get there eventually, and they'll eventually want to become good employers of people with disability, and it will happen organically as society changes. That ain't working. It's just not working. Or if it is working, it's not working fast enough.
G'day, I'm Deborah Caldo, and welcome to the Red Giraffe Solutions Expanding Worlds podcast, where we aim to support you as you help your young person with additional needs plan for their future. A future where they are safe, secure, and live a rewarding and fulfilling life. From around the world, I share stories and share solutions from people making this possible right now. I'm a parent of a young person with additional needs, so I understand the challenges. Many of the people I've interviewed on this podcast have already helped me design a better future for my daughter, and I hope that they might help you as well to imagine what's possible for your young person. There's been a bit of a break since my last episode, in part because I went back to Australia for the first time in 7 years. And in a way that's helped me reset the podcast, because moving forward episodes will be weekly, focusing on just one idea, and that will also mean that the episodes will be a bit shorter. Because what I've realised is that I like to have conversations with my guests, and that inevitably means that we discuss lots of different topics. So I think a shorter, more focused approach will enable me to better share the stories and the solutions that they share with me. So obviously on my trip back home, I was keen to find people with stories and solutions worth sharing, and I'm delighted to start with Peter Bacon from Disability Employment Australia. After a degree in politics, Peter started working in the disability sector, firstly on the front line and then in strategic roles. Peter is originally from the UK, but he's lived in Australia for about 7 years, and for the past year has been the CEO of Disability Employment Australia. In my conversation with Peter, we talk about what Disability Employment Australia does, but really our conversation is much broader than that. Because we're talking about employment and we talk about the speed of change, inclusive employers and reasonable adjustments, issues that apply wherever you live. If you're thinking about the ways that we can improve the stats around employment, Peter has some interesting ideas around that as well. Welcome, Peter. What is the role of Disability Employment Australia?
The big thing that we're trying to do is we are trying to work, as I suppose, a bit of an intermediary level between service providers and people with disability and government to change policy for the better, so more people with disability get the chance to go into work and do well there and unlock their full, well, I'd say full economic potential, but if you're unlocking your full economic potential, you're really unlocking your potential in all sorts of different ways. And sort of fostering inclusion through that perspective. So the way we work is we're not a government service. We don't take a penny from the government, which enables us to be quite independent. But we have members. So our members are primarily those who deliver the services. And we have currently, I think, about 2/3 of those who deliver disability employment services are our members. Policy and advocacy is probably our biggest role, and alongside that we also take an interest in things like training and workforce competence and professional development, and we host several different events a year. So we run a national annual conference for disability employment, and we have things beyond that. So the biggest thing that we're really trying to do is to make sure that the government policy settings are as good as they can be in terms of unlocking the talent that's there in terms of people with disability. And frankly, we've got a big job on there.
The service providers that you deal with, what are some of the biggest challenges they come to you and say, this is where we need government policy, say, for example, to change or to evolve?
There's quite a few different areas. Obviously, there's some technical aspects in the way that the contract is run. So that might be things like, the way that you evidence the fact that someone's in work, that could be done better. There are those things. But there are also some much bigger things that members talk to me about on a policy level. So one of the big things that we're doing at the moment is there was a 4-year-long disability royal commission. That was looking at everything, not just employment, although employment was part of it, but it was really a pretty thorough interrogation into the experience of people with disability in Australia, the abuse they suffer, the exclusion that's at the heart of the experience of people with disability in Australia. And there's a huge way to go. Like, you read through that and just exclusion radiates from every page. And employment's part of that, and the workplace is part of that. It's not that those things are separate, it's that they are symptoms of a disease. So, yes, we seek to address the symptoms, as any good doctor would, by going, well, actually, here's what we can do in a technical way with a contract that's being delivered. But we're also interested in the disease, exclusion, and how we can help change that. So, to that point, the government is currently consulting on the recommendations that have come from the Disability Royal Commission, and we're putting in a massive response, really, to outline how we think a vision that could take Australia forward when it comes to disability employment would look like. If we were to halve the gap between the labour force participation between people with disability and people without disability, what would that look like in practice? So there's a number of different things that we're looking at, and so some of that is around the Disability Employment Service and reforming that. But actually, some of the bigger things are like, well, let's actually think about what human rights, if they were applied properly to disability employment, what would that approach actually look like? Because even though Australia is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, not everything is really well calibrated to that. So let's say you're a person with disability, you want to go onto Disability Employment Service. How do you do it? Well, you have to prove that you're exactly the right amount of disabled to get onto the Disability Employment Service. It's really not very much to do with what your personal preference is as a person with disability. It's to do with, well, we think you can work somewhere between 8 and 30 hours. You're in receipt of income support and therefore you're eligible. Okay. But all of that is the medical model of disability, right? None of that is a social model. None of that is about the obstacles that we place in people's way as a society. It's all to do with what the docs think. That's not a human rights-based approach. And that's just one example. We have found loads of examples of where we're not applying the social model, which is against Australia's treaty obligations. And I'm hoping will be against Australia's legislative obligations once they've legislated an Australian Disability Rights Act. So there's all of that stuff. And then there's stuff which I suspect you want to talk about, which is around the demand side. I'm being too jargonistic there perhaps, in saying, well, what are we going to do about employers? Now, I don't want to sit here and employer bash, but what we can say is that the organic approach of just saying, well, employers will get there eventually, and they'll eventually want to become good employers of people with disability, and it will happen organically as society changes. That ain't working. It's just not working. Or if it is working, it's not working fast enough. We need to really think around, well, what are we going to do to change the game there? What policy levers can we pull to bring employers to the table that are actually going to work and not be tokenistic? And what support do employers need to get better employing people with disability? So there's those things which are very much part of the question too, in terms of, well, how do we improve disability employment for the better? So it's all those kind of questions that are the ones that we're engaging in with our members, with our partners, with people with disability, to actually really try and not just trim around the edges when it comes to disability employment, but, if there's 54%, labour force participation for people with disability in Australia of working age people with disability, that isn't good enough. That means that nearly half the people who could be working aren't, and we've got to change that.
What do you think of some of the reasons for the employers? Because it always strikes me it's lack of knowledge about what it means to employ someone with a disability. And there's always that reasonable adjustments that comes up because organisations don't understand the process or how to do that and don't realise that they already do it all the time. Is it lack of knowledge, or is there sort of something to do with the system and the way the system works? Because it's interesting they're talking about what I'd call bureaucracy, which is the assessment process, where you're assessed on, scales rather than being a person, which is totally unacceptable anyway, whether you're disabled or not.
Yeah, of course. It's completely the wrong way to run a system. I mean, I'd always start off with, well, what does the individual in front of you want? And then you can build from there. If someone wants to go onto a disability employment service because they're a person with disability who wants a job, why would we throw up barriers? But that's a slightly separate question to the one which you're asking, which is about employer attitudes or employer knowledge and understanding. And I think it's kind of an all of the above answer. But what I'll do is I'll talk about it in terms of a typology of different employers. So I basically say there's 3 buckets, right? There's employers that care about disability employment and are already doing it well. Not that big a group. Then you've got, on the other flip side of that, is employers that don't care. And by definition, if you don't care about disability employment, you won't be doing it well. And then you've got the vast amount in the middle, of which there are different shades, but the vast amount of organisations in the middle which would actually in theory like to be good employers of people with disability. Business owners don't set out to exclude necessarily, but it's just a byproduct. But haven't necessarily got the knowledge or have made the intentional choice to do it better, or gone out and investigated how they can do it and got that confidence level around doing it. That's most employers. That's true in the UK. It's true in Australia. So the question is, with that big group in the middle there, which I've not done the research piece, but it's probably 75%, 80% of employers. Well, how do we change that into them getting to the first bucket? And a lot of it comes down to, I think, normalisation. Going, well, actually, this is just part of what we do standardly as our business. So I was speaking to a guy who works in McDonald's, actually. He works in their human resources team, and he was saying, across this relatively small area of Queensland, we've recruited 50 people with disability. And actually, it's relatively easy. You make adjustments, but they aren't that hard. And actually, I've got all these different franchises coming on board now saying we want to do this because it makes complete sense for us, because we're unlocking talent that's there. But that's about the normalisation of disability employment for those businesses. And it's about that, having that tangible example of someone saying, well, actually, it can work. Here it is. Here's a very equivalent business. Do it. How do you get to that point of normalisation? Unfortunately, the only way to get to that point of normalisation is for people just to do it. But you want to make sure that people are doing it in the right way. So how are you setting the conditions to do that? Now, when I speak to lots of employers about this kind of stuff, they say, I just don't feel that confident about it. I don't feel like I'm going to ask the right questions. I feel worried I'm going to say the wrong thing. To which I say, maybe you will, but people with disabilities are people, and as long as they know they're coming from the right place, you're going to be set fair 99.9% of the time. And when you talk about reasonable adjustments, she just mentioned, there's so many misconceptions about reasonable adjustments. You go to an employee, talk about adjustments, say, I can't put ramps all the way through my office. And you go, well, in the case of this particular person, we're actually just asking you to slightly change their hours. Because their medication means they're dusty in the morning. Like, I'm not asking you to put ramps in. Like, for the right person, obviously, they need to make sure that they're doing that. But there's so many misconceptions that need to be unwound. And then there's the piece around actually really celebrating disability employment and sort of demythologizing the fact that it's difficult, because most of the time it's not that hard. But there's a huge amount to do that. And that's why I say I don't think the organic approach has worked, because the stuff I'm talking about has probably been the case for a very long time. So what are we going to do that actually gives it a bit of a shove? I'm interested in looking at the Disability Confidence Scheme in the UK, because there's things to learn from it. And then I think there's bits that you can look at in terms of things like mandatory reporting of what your, for larger employers, 100 up, let's say, of what your sort of proportion of people with disability in the workforce is. Now, there are risks around that, and we need to make sure that organisations know how to do disclosure in a positive and psychologically safe way. But we've got to look at those things. You can't just keep on with the status quo.
Do you think that's the role of the service providers? Because the good service providers are actually not only supporting people to get paid work, but also supporting the employer with training to help them understand about how reasonable a reasonable adjustment is. So is that the service providers that need to sort of step up there?
It's a yes and a no to that. So yes, there is a role for service providers in doing that kind of work. And the best providers are doing that. They're working with the employer, they're working with their participant, and they're tailoring it to make sure that person has all the right support they need to succeed in work. However, and this is where we need to be clear about what the role of something like a disability employment service is. It's a participant-centred model. So when you're delivering it well, you're building the plan around them, you're building everything around that participant, which is great. And then when you bring the employer into that participant-centred model, also good. However, there's a whole bunch of employers around the country who aren't working with things like a disability employment service, who you're not placing someone with, so they're not doing that work. So it becomes a little bit chicken and egg, because if the employer doesn't do the work to think around how they can be a good employer of someone with disability, they don't necessarily engage with the disability employment service. So this is why I say the supply side's kind of there. Disability employment service is a good service, it's effective, but what is there for those employers that aren't engaging with that. And even then, again, it's a participant-centered model. So you're not necessarily changing that entire business. You're making sure that the support is around that person. You're not saying, well, I mean, sometimes you might do it. Like, you have some really great partnerships where an organisation might go, right, we're going to work with you in a certain area, and we're going to look at how you can change everything around your business so you can employ 20 people from our caseload. So really the answer is yes, good service providers do that, but it's not their role to change the way that employers work across Australia. That role is currently unfulfilled.
Obviously, the key question that was raised in my conversation with Peter was whether inclusive employment can be achieved organically, or in fact, it will only happen with legal guidance in place to make it happen. I think before I spoke to Peter and reflected on what he said, I was probably in favour of the organic approach, partly because I've seen how well it can work with my own daughter. She's been through a supported employment program and then a supported internship, and even now that she's employed, she still has support from that service provider, and they provide support to her employer as well if it's needed. But in reality, wherever you are, when it comes to employment, the stats are pretty depressing. So taking that into account, I can see why we do need stronger incentives to push up the number of employers offering opportunities to our young people. It'll be interesting to follow how this works in Australia and the impact it has, assuming that the legal framework that Peter talked about becomes a reality. In the meantime, I think we can all play an important role in making employers see that being an inclusive employer makes business sense in terms of not only accessing great employees, but also in terms of being the kind of business that we all want to buy from. I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that the stories and the solutions shared on here help you as you support your young person to create their future. And if you know anyone who would find the ideas useful, please share the podcast with them. Of course, if you want to, you can leave a review, because that is another way families who need this information can find it more easily. This show is created as part of Red Giraffe Solutions. To find out what the Red Giraffe is all about, visit redgiraffesolutions.com, where you'll find more resources around daily living, relationships, purpose and financial security. I'm @Bricaldo on Instagram and Facebook. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to have a conversation with you on any of those. Bye for now.